Hi, thanks for joining us today. I'm Jeremy Spivey. I'm a market research analyst here at Wingswept, and I'm very excited to introduce today's webinar host. Mark Anderson of Anderson Investigative Associates is an expert in interviewing techniques for professionals working in investigative and auditing offices. He's a retired special agent with the Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General. He's also been a program manager and instructor at the Inspector General Criminal Investigator Academy, where he managed both the advanced interviewing for IG investigators and the interviewing for fraud auditors programs. So if you're looking for advice on how to get the best results out of your interviews, it would be pretty hard to find someone more experienced or qualified than Mark. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy, for that introduction. And we're going to be talking today about some emerging trends in interviewing and debunking some old tales. This is possibly part one of two on this topic of emerging trends, because there's a lot going on in the interviewing landscape that we should keep track of with changes and things that will improve the way we do interviews. Jeremy talked a little bit about my background. What I am is somebody who loves interviewing. There was lots of things in the job I didn't like. I wasn't always up to date on my timesheets and getting those car logs done, but there was nothing more exciting than going out and getting into the interview room and dealing with that dynamic of getting individuals to tell us the truth, give us quality information, and so that's what it's really about when we go out and do these interviews. There's some ways to get hold of me, which we'll show you at the end. If you have questions, you want additional information on what we're talking about, this obviously is a summary of a lot of research that's been done and a lot of information that's out there with regard to these emerging trends. What we're going to look at today is what some recent interviewing studies say and what they say about us as investigators and interviewers. We're going to look at some myths regarding eye-accessing cues, because there's a ton of information out there, much of it that's not empirically supported with research and evidence that would make it something we should follow. And then finally, we're going to look at some recent developments in recording interviews, which is not necessarily a new thing to state and local investigators, but it's something that's changing dynamically on the federal landscape. If we do a second webinar on this, we're going to look at some other things, such as techniques to enhance deception detection in interviews. We're going to talk about a lot of verbal indicators there. We're just going to brush on that a little bit today as well. And then verbal cues to deception, memory, cognition, and techniques. Talk a little bit about cognitive interviewing and talk a little bit about the cognitive load theory. So what we're looking at today, and the first area I want to talk to you about, is this issue of interviewing studies. There's been a lot of studies done, and when we talk about these studies, we're looking mainly at individuals that do inspector general type investigations, individuals that do employee misconduct investigation, internal affairs, and these studies were done in the United States and Great Britain. So a similar group to a lot of the individuals that I speak to in the training environment on a frequent basis. There's some very disappointing results from these studies, although not particularly surprising. The data that was collected, it's statistically significant, and it's important for us to understand, because it certainly has changed some of the dynamic of how I do interviews and things that I needed to hone in on. The important thing here, I'm not a research guy, I'm not an academician. What I'm looking at these studies for is their connection to the actual work environment and what we see happening on the interview landscape. And what we're seeing is a lot of these studies are very consistent with what we're seeing in the training environment that are causing problems for interviewers in conducting successful interviews. So it's always important to start with some positives and talk about those. And some of those positives are that we see interviewers generally displaying ethical interviewing standards. We're going by the book in how we do these interviews. We're following the rules and the policies and procedures laid out for us. Now, Sometimes I'm not sure the reason we're doing that isn't because we're under such scrutiny at this point in time, or that our techniques are good enough that we can do this, but this is a very good thing. The second thing is that we're frequently using open-ended questioning techniques. We're not playing into the dragnet type of interview where we're asking yes/no questions and closed-ended questions, because those questions and the answers to them it's very difficult to assess credibility and detect deception because those answers are so short. I'm probably going to challenge you to use more open-ended questioning, and if we do the second webinar, there's going to be a good indication of why we should do that based on the cognitive load theory and some of the verbal indicators to deception, which are very reliable to us when we do interviews. What we see is some persistent problems is insufficient planning and preparation for interviews. Now, and it says less than 10% of all interviews have adequate planning and preparation. Now, we know where we need to go. We know who we need to talk to. We likely know how to get there. We know what the crime or violation is we're there to ask about. But we don't have enough planning in the area of who is this person? What type of issues is this person having at this point in time? Where is this person's Achilles heel based on their history with the organization, their interrelationship with others? So we need to do adequate planning. Now, I recognize that we all have a lot on our plates, and we're not always able to do that. But you, as the professional interviewer, need to assess, how important is this interview? How much do I need an admission in this interview? And then based on that, you're going to have to assign the amount of planning and preparation necessary. The next area is shortfalls in rapport building. Again, less than 10% of interviews have adequate rapport building. Now, we certainly often think we're pretty good at rapport because we can talk about the weather and our favorite sports team. But I'm talking about getting to those levels of rapport, moving through that casual level of rapport, moving to that personal level of rapport, getting to that intimate level of rapport where you understand that person and that person is more likely to admit things to you because you've established that relationship and that commonality with them during the interview process. So we need to work on that area of rapport building. I do a ton of training in that area of rapport building to get us to move beyond that surfacey rapport, which isn't going to really create the results that we're looking for. And then the last area is inadequate listening skills. I'm more and more convinced this is a huge issue. I understand that we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, although I have a ton of relatives that don't recognize that. We need to become better listeners. We need to not be thinking about the next question we're going to ask, the next thing we want to say, but actually listen to understand the individual that we're talking to. If we do that, we're going to get much more quality information to be able to connect with this person and get admissions from them. These are some of the training results that we look at. The research clearly shows that individuals that have been trained adequately outstrip the performance of their untrained colleagues in some of the areas that you see right there. I spent almost all of my career in the field learning by making mistakes. I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. I would have just as soon not made all those mistakes. And if I had had more training along the way in interviewing skills and interacting with people that do this frequently, probably I would have been more equipped to do some of the interviews that I might not have been as successful at. We also see that the research clearly states that refresher interview training improves the performance of these advanced techniques among interviewers. And I've done plenty of classes where I've had people in those classes that have been on the job for 20, 25 years, local police departments, federal agents that have not had a lot of interview training. And they spoke to the value of that training just to rekindle some of the things that have dropped off the page, or to give them some new techniques or new tools for their tool belt that would make them more effective. Now, the one thing that stops this from being valuable is if you go into that training with the attitude you're not going to learn anything, or that you already know it, then that training is probably wasteful for you. I sit in training with colleagues that I work with that I've sat in the same block of training 4 or 5 times, and there's not a time I sit there that I don't glean something that can be worked into my interviewing repertoire to make me a better interviewer. It's great to get that refresher training. Some of the misnomers associated with training, I'm seeing this more and more, is that many organizations have that concept that once you're trained in interviewing, there's no need for additional training. I mean, heck, all you're doing is going out there and talking to somebody. And they also see interview training as not being a priority to the work product. We're becoming more and more relying on technological and electronic means to do investigation, but we also know that that's never going to replace the human interaction to find out the why this happened, to find out the details of how it happened and everything else. So, a short-sighted way to look at it. We see much more focus on technical training, agency requirements, things like that. And then there's those that assume that anyone can interview. And these are just misnomers that are not beneficial to the investigator or the auditor in the field. We've all learned interviewing via a variety of methods, and there's a lot of great methods out there. Almost everything I see involves the process of doing steps. If I have these 9 steps or I have these 18 steps, then at the end of those steps, I'm going to have a confession. I'm going to have all the information I need. And this concept of focusing on steps can really compromise a complete interview, compromise the details that we're going to get out of it. And then when we do those steps and don't have the answer we want, we wonder why. I had an individual in a training class, a federal agent trainee, that did the interview and got done with it. He said, "Hey, I did all the steps and I got them all done and I have nothing to show for it." And I had to look at him and say, "Yeah, but you did each of those steps poorly and you got exactly what you put into it." We need to look at the concept of interviewing in a much more holistic way than that it is a process of steps. That really limits our ability to understand and comprehend the person sitting before us fully. And so one of the things that we look at, one of the things that we focus on a lot is this concept of essentials for effective interviewing. And really what we see the interviewing process is a circle. It's a place where you can fall into any of these: planning, process, perspective, and persuasion at any particular point. We look at planning and consider it to be before we get in that interview room, but how many times have you been in that interview room and based on what somebody said early in the process, you realize very clearly that this interview is going in a different direction, and now the strategy has to be put into the place. How do I change this direction? How do I get on board and go where it's going at this point? So these things can enter at any different point. An example of this is rapport is very important to the interview, but if you go into that interview room and you try to establish commonality by conducting rapport, and that person looks at you and says, "Hey, I really just want to get down to what we're here about today. I really don't want to chit chat with you." If we continue rapport, then we do far more to compromise the results of our interview than if we move along where they want to go and just recognize somewhere later in that circle, I'm going to have to get back to rapport to establish that commonality. And there's plenty of techniques and tools to do that, which we talk about an awful lot when we talk about rapport building. Remember, on these interviews, rather than a step process, although that step process is going to fall into here, there's got to be a beginning, middle, and end like a conversation. I want the interview room to be like a conversation because that's where I'm going to get the best results. That's where I'm going to generate the most information from it. And infused throughout that process is this issue of rapport. And how do I maintain the stress level in the interview by addressing rapport and sliding with the rapport? And that's something that we need to be focused on throughout that interview process. Uh, I talked to you a little bit about this concept of verbal and nonverbal behavior, so I just want to address it here for a minute. It's a fascinating area in interview instruction. Lots of courses that I've watched and participated in, there's a huge focus on nonverbal behavior and its connection with deception. I mean, there's TV shows on that, the whole issue of body language. And it's important to observe. But when you look at the question there, how good are we as interviewers at detecting deception via nonverbal behaviors? The studies that have been done show that we're about 51% accurate, which is like flipping a coin. And that's not a real good standard to use for interviews. And so what we see is there's a lot of research now being put into this area of verbal indicators of deception. And I actually spend more time on verbal indicators of deception in the training that we do than I do the nonverbals. Now, I don't want you to close your eyes and only listen. That's like doing a telephone interview. But in conjunction with what we're seeing, what we should focus on is what we're hearing. How is this person saying what they're saying? Some of the research that's being done in this area at this point in time, and there's a lot of research being done on the cognitive load theory and cognitive interviewing, is that we are much better at detecting deception via verbal indicators. And think about it, anybody that's a parent, anybody that's well, if you're not a parent, you were a child at one point in time, and then those lies to parents or the lies that you're being told or the distortions that's there, you realize you recognize a lot of what's going on just by what they say. My son comes to me, and when he uses the word actually to start a sentence, I know I'm in for being taken for a ride. So we want to listen for those words. And with those verbal indicators, the research shows that we can be about 85% accurate in our detection of deception. And we also know that some of the information out there on nonverbal indicators of deception are just simply not supported. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that as we move into this second area of eye accessing cues. And when we talk about eye accessing cues, man, it's great fun. I mean, there's TV shows that were done on this, like Lie to Me, where we talk about eye movement. And I'm sure as I'm talking to you about this, you're thinking about some of the things you've been told on eye movement. And I would suspect that some of you are sitting there and saying, oh, yeah, I remember learning if you look up and to the left, you're lying, or something along that line. Or if left-handers are the opposite of right-handers, so they're going to look the opposite way. There's a ton of information out there, and there's a lot of that information that is not supported by empirical evidence. And I know that people are using it in the interview environment. Now, I'm not saying dismiss what's being said with the eyes, but I'm saying use it in the proper way. And in any of these things, any nonverbal behaviors that we're talking about, as well as verbal behaviors, remember, we have to baseline the individual we're talking to, because each person responds differently in the face of hard questions versus easy questions. So we have to baseline them on information that we believe is true in order to establish how their eye movement occurs. And then what we're looking for during the interview itself, or during the questions that we aren't sure about the truthfulness of, is we're looking for those opposite eye movements. This is what I want to show you from the eye accessing cues. And if anybody has interest on this, I can provide you the biography, the sources that I used in order to generate this information. None of this is coming from my, my own mind here. On the eye accessing cues, recognize that what we see happening is you do look one way or the other. It's almost like file cabinets, whether you're recalling or creating information. So if I asked you to sit back and think about the first residence you ever lived in and to count the number of windows in it, you're going to go to a certain file cabinet where you're going to look for that information, and you're going to recall that information and then talk to me about it. So for me, I'm going to go to my first house in Dundee, New York, walk out the front door, stand in that front yard, and start counting those windows. When I do this, I'm going to look up and to the left, which is my quadrant for visual recall. Now, the other side of it is what's called visual create. So if I asked you what the offspring of an ostrich and a giraffe looks like, Hopefully you don't go to the recall file cabinet for that. If you do, you might want to see a doctor about that. Hopefully what you do is you go to the create cabinet, where you take this ostrich and this giraffe and mate them and then tell me what it looks like. Now, what you might see at the beginning of this is a quick look to the left and then move to the right, because what you're doing is visually recalling an ostrich and visually recalling a giraffe, and then taking them to the other file cabinet to mate them. On the audio recall, if I said you went to do the first thing you heard this morning, what was it? And that's where you might go and say, oh, it was the alarm clock. It was the alarm clock, and you're going to look to that side to do that. So let's talk about what we see happening with this. Oh, this thing is jumping on me here. Sorry about that. I'm not getting the percentages on here. Well, let me explain to you what they are. For some reason, this isn't coming up right for me. What we see happening here is we don't see any indication that left-handers do anything opposite of right-handers. For a matter of fact, when you look at the percentages, 73% of individuals look up and to the left for visual recall, which is the area I go to as well. And when you have left-handed people, they actually look up and to the left about 73% up and to the left. Left-handers look up and to the left about 77% of the time. So they're actually more normative here. Then you have a percentage, 14% look up and to the right for visual recall. And then you have a group of 5% that are defocused for recall. And those are the people that you ask the question. It's almost like they're looking right through you. They're not focused on you. And then you have another group of 4% who they have no baseline. They're all over the place on that. Now, remember, with regard to what's happening here, what you're seeing here is not truth or lie. And that's how it's been depicted before. If you look one way, you're lying. If you look the other way, you're telling the truth. The fact is, it's recall and create. And you can actually look to your recall side and still be lying. Think about it. Individuals that we speak to in the interview environment, oftentimes those people have already rehearsed their lie and told it to somebody else. And all they're in fact doing is restating a lie they've already told. So in order to recall that, they're going to look to that recall side. We often don't get to see them for the first time created. I often say when I'm on the road, and if one of my children pulls some sort of move that needs to be addressed, I often say to my wife to leave it alone until I get home. And the reason I say that is I want to be sitting in front of him when he creates the story. I don't want to hear that story that's already been told previous. And remember, with any of this, you got to use bio and report to establish a good recall baseline. You want to camouflage the questions so they appear natural. I wouldn't recommend in an interview to say, hey, how many windows were in the first house you lived in? That's going to just create more problems than it's worth. But you can ask questions regarding their job, regarding a previous situation that's going to force them into that recall file cabinet to get the information that you're looking for. The last area I want to talk about here is the issue of recent developments in recorded interviews. This has been a hot button issue on the federal side for the last several years. I originally wrote a lesson plan on this in the 2009 timeframe for the federal government because as a proactive measure, because we saw this coming and generating and starting to pick up some traction and wanted to be ahead of the power curve on the issue of training. It's been used minimally. I might be talking to people today who are in federal agencies that are establishing the concept of how they're going to do these and how they're going to implement them into their offices. And the tough thing about that, you know, on the Inspector General side of the federal government, there's 70 bit differently, which is going to cause some problems from the administrative and the judicial side with how they're going to be handled in court or in administrative hearings. Remember where this comes from. This started up back in when Miranda was put into effect, and you had problems with that because the whole point of Miranda created this sort of incommunicado environment where you had two people sitting in a room, and how do we know what really happened in that room? That became an issue, and it became an issue much earlier than I originally imagined. Since in 1980, the Supreme Court of Alaska addressed this issue and required the use of recording devices. And this has grown exponentially since that point in time in 1980. 1994, the Supreme Court of Minnesota followed the Alaska decision. In 2004, we saw Massachusetts issue a ruling. 2005, we saw that there was a legislative statute to record custodial interviews in Illinois, and it's just continued to increase. As of today, 11 states have enacted statutes regarding recordings. The highest courts of 3 states have mandated electronic recordings, and we have over 450 plus departments across all 50 states that are recording, and we see this number increasing weekly. When you talk to some of the local and state guys, man, they've been doing this for a while. They're very comfortable with it. I don't see that same thing happening on the federal side, which is why we generated training to make people more comfortable with that process. I did it in several organizations that I worked for, and was pretty familiar with it when I was asked to write lesson plans with regard to recording interviews. What do we see happening here on this, the trend? Because of this increase that we've seen across the board, the federal government is being forced to adopt the recording process as being necessary. There was a few holdouts on that. The FBI was holding out for quite a while, but the Department of Justice got involved, and there was some mandates with regard to that, but really no clear guidance as to how each organization had to do it. So when it was being implemented, how it was being implemented, and all the rest, we're seeing a lot of variation in that. The concept was, the expectation was the ease and the availability of recording devices and the inexpense associated with it. Why are we not, in fact, doing these recordings? And we were starting to see issues in courtrooms and administrative hearings of cases being thrown out because there weren't recordings. You know, the Podunk Police Department was recording, but the great federal government wasn't recording. Why should we listen to this case? And that's become a huge problem, that inconsistency in the application of recording protocols. This inconsistency developed some issues from a court and administrative proceedings process. You know, how are we going to do it? Are we going to audio record? Are we going to audio visual record? Are we advising of the recording being made? There's different requirements there, be it a federal, state, or local situation. Are we recording the entire interview, or are we just going back and recording the confession? And there's all sorts of problems with regard to that if we don't do it in a consistent manner, which is another reason it requires some training. We also see that a lot of organizations rushed into it. They were told they needed to do it, so they started doing it, and they did it without the foresight to establish a credible program. They had not budgeted enough for adequate staff, adequate equipment in order to have consistent recordings. There wasn't enough finances available to just transcribe all the recordings. So how are they deciding which interviews are supposed to be transcribed, you know, which ones aren't? Do they have any policies and procedures being implemented for these recordings? It's a problem that's needs to be addressed and needs to be consistently addressed. How did the recordings affect the interview environment? That was one of the big fears. And when I talked to local guys that were doing interviews far before they were recorded, they were very concerned about having the recordings put into effect. The fact is, putting the recordings into effect and doing it in a professional manner can actually help you in the interview room. They can be confession suppressors, but there's plenty of things we can say to get rid of that burden associated with it and make them helpful to us. They also really cut down on the amount of time that interviewers have to spend on the stand, because there isn't question about what you're doing. There isn't question about what's going on in the room, because they can look, they can see, they can hear and they know that we're following those ethical interviewing standards that we talked about earlier on in this webinar. Who expects it? At this point, everybody expects it. Judges, juries, the press. If we're not doing it, there's going to be criticism associated with it. So it's pretty much across the board that is expected. When we get into this recorded interview, we have to make sure that we're collecting and preserving that confession evidence in the most unbiased and efficient manner. Remember, these interrogations are inherently private, so we have to take appropriate protocols to take care of that evidence. Remember that the limited numbers that are present can result in that perception of tainted testimony, and there's some of the reasons that there are issues with us not recording. We have that evidence. We have it in a digital format. We have audio or video, and that's going to show exactly what took place in that interview room. So here's a quote I love. I use it in several of my training. In any case, keep cool, have unlimited patience, never corner an opponent, and always assist him to save face. Put yourself in his shoes so as to see things through his eyes. Avoid self-righteousness like the devil, nothing so self-blinding. Basil Hart. Great quote there. And I thank you very much for the time I got to spend with you today. These are some of the courses that we deal with at Anderson Investigative Associates. I kind of packed a lot into a half an hour, which is typical. I was told to keep it, down to the 30 minutes, and that seems to be a difficult thing for me. So if I generate any thoughts or interest in your mind, and you need some way to get a hold of me, here's some ways to get a hold of me. Don't be afraid to reach out to me, and I'd be glad to talk to you again. And I thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Mark. I hope everyone had the opportunity to gain some insight from the information that Mark provided. I feel like that was a lot of really good information, probably an hour worth of information in 30 minutes. So thank you. I appreciate it. As Mark had mentioned, if you'd like to contact him to ask about anything that he talked about today, information's right here on the screen. For those of you not familiar with Wingswept, we provide a case management and tracking system, or CMTS, which is designed specifically for investigative agencies. We've been building and continuously improving case management systems for investigative agencies for over a decade now, and we're one of the most trusted providers in federal, state, and local government for that type of software. So if you're looking for a software solution to align your people, processes, and workflows, we'd love to discuss our product more in detail with you. You can reach us at 919-600-5102. So thanks again for taking the time to join us today. We do provide these educational and webinars for investigative professionals each month, and I look forward to seeing you at next month's webinar, hopefully. Thanks.